It started with a letter, a crisp, white envelope taped to the front door of my lakeside home, its neat lettering bearing the seal of the Homeowners Association. The paper carried that same artificial sense of authority the HOA often tried to project, as though the stamped logo on the corner was a decree from some higher court. But I had lived long enough in this community to know that these letters were rarely about fairness. They were warnings, threats disguised as reminders, and demands hidden beneath the guise of policy. I opened the envelope with a weary sense of curiosity, already bracing myself for whatever complaint was coming next. Inside was a printed sheet, the words bold at the top. Notice of violation. The offense was listed in sharp black ink. My boat. According to the letter, my boat, tied neatly to my private dock at the back of my property, was in clear violation of community guidelines regarding unsightly objects and unauthorized watercraft. The HOA claimed it was disrupting the harmony of the neighborhood's appearance and, unless removed within 14 days, I would be fined heavily for non-compliance. At first, I thought it must be a mistake. My boat wasn't some rusted wreck or abandoned hull. It was a modest fishing boat, kept in good condition, resting at the water's edge of a lake that had been in my family for generations. I had spent countless mornings casting lines into its waters, the sun rising over the tree line. The lake, a mirror of peace. To think of it now as a violation, as though it were graffiti scrawled across some wall, was not just absurd, it was insulting. The HOA, however, thrived on absurdity. For months, I had heard whispers of their pettiness, their crusades against neighbors for minor details, a slightly mismatched shade of paint, lawn chairs left on porches, even the color of seasonal decorations. But I had never been their direct target. My property was tidy, my home maintained. I had assumed they had no reason to bother me. Clearly, I was wrong. The letter continued in its sharp, legalistic tone, citing vague passages of community guidelines about aesthetics and orderliness. It accused my boat of being excessive, out of character, and a visual obstruction. At the bottom, a signature in looping script confirmed it. The HOA president, a woman known for her rigid enforcement of rules and her obsession with appearances. I set the letter down on my kitchen table and stared out the window, where the boat sat calmly in the gentle sway of the lake. The hypocrisy of it all pressed in on me. That same lake was used by the entire neighborhood. Every weekend, families strolled to its banks, kayaks launched from community access points, and children splashed in its shallows. The HOA promoted it as the crown jewel of the neighborhood, a communal treasure. And yet here they were, declaring my boat, the boat I used on the very same waters, as a blemish. The irony ran deeper than they realized, because while they may have claimed jurisdiction over lawns and mailboxes, they had overlooked one very important fact: the lake was mine, entirely mine. Decades ago, when my grandparents settled here, the land included the full body of water. As the years passed, developers built homes around its perimeter, selling the dream of lakeside living while leasing limited access rights. The HOA formed later when the community expanded, but the ownership of the water itself had never transferred. Every deed in the county confirmed it. The lake remained private property, belonging to my family, passed down generation after generation, until it was mine. The HOA might pretend they had authority over the water, but their power stopped at the edge of my property line. Still, they seemed either unaware of that fact or arrogantly dismissive of it. And now they were trying to punish me for having a boat on my own lake. I could have dismissed the letter, tossed it in the trash, and gone about my day. But I knew the HOA. Ignoring them only emboldened them. They thrived on control, and once they set their sights on you, they would escalate. Today, it was my boat. Tomorrow, it could be my dock, my backyard, or even the land beneath my home. I thought back to neighbors who had received similar notices. One man, ordered to repaint his house because the shade of beige he chose was too warm. Another family, fined for leaving their kids' bikes visible in the driveway. Each time, the HOA had pushed until the residents either complied or broke, but none of those neighbors had leverage. None of them owned the very resource the HOA boasted about in their glossy brochures and sales pitches. I did. As I folded the letter back into its envelope, a plan began to form. I would not respond with anger, nor would I beg for leniency. I would let the HOA play their little game, follow their process, send their warnings and fines. And when the time was right, I would remind them, forcefully, undeniably, that their beloved lake was not theirs to regulate. But patience was required. The HOA thrived on documentation, on building their case with precision. I needed to let them dig their hole deep enough that, when I lowered the truth upon them, it would not just be a rebuttal, but a collapse of their entire authority over me. Outside, the boat rocked gently against its tether, the water shimmering around it. To anyone else, it was nothing more than a small vessel at rest. To me, it was a symbol of family, of history, of rightful ownership. And now, thanks to the HOA's arrogance, it was about to become the center of a conflict that would shake the entire neighborhood. The letter claimed my boat violated community guidelines. Soon, they would learn the community itself was standing on water that was never theirs to begin with. And so, I waited. I watched the days pass, neighbors walking past with polite nods, children laughing along the shore, kayaks slipping across the water. All the while, the HOA circled closer, their next move inevitable. When it came, I would be ready. The second letter arrived exactly 14 days later, slipped into my mailbox with the same official seal stamped across the top. This time, the message was sharper, its language more aggressive. The HOA declared that since I had failed to remove the unauthorized watercraft, I was now subject to a fine of $200, payable within 10 business days. If I did not comply, the fines would double, compounding every week until the violation was resolved. It was a calculated move, one they had used before. The HOA thrived on financial pressure. They understood that most homeowners in the neighborhood dreaded confrontation and would pay whatever was demanded just to keep the peace. A small boat, a mailbox, a patch of grass, none of it was worth months of escalating fees and legal threats. People caved, and the HOA banked on that pattern repeating itself. But I wasn't most homeowners. I set the letter down on the table beside the first, my mind replaying the countless stories I had heard from neighbors. The HOA's fines were rarely challenged, and when they were, the burden always fell on the homeowner to prove their innocence. They kept everything vague, citing sections of the community guidelines that were conveniently open to interpretation. And if someone resisted too loudly, they resorted to intimidation, threatening liens on properties, dragging cases to court, or shaming residents in community meetings. It was all a performance of power designed to scare. But what they didn't realize was that their performance was staged on my stage. Their authority balanced precariously over water they didn't own. Still, I didn't act immediately. Instead, I observed. I knew their next steps would be predictable, and I wanted to see just how far they would go before I pulled the rug out from under them. Days passed, and the tension grew. A few neighbors mentioned the letters casually in passing, their tones filled with sympathy, but also curiosity. Word had spread quickly that the HOA was targeting me. Some wondered aloud if the boat would be gone soon, as though it were a foregone conclusion. Others whispered about the president herself, a woman whose rigid adherence to aesthetic harmony had made her infamous. She lived on the far side of the lake, her house immaculate, her garden trimmed to perfection. She was the type who measured her neighbors' lawns with a ruler and took pictures of offenses to present at meetings. It didn't take long before the president herself appeared. One afternoon, I noticed her car parked across the street, her sharp gaze fixed on my dock. She didn't knock or approach, but instead stood at a distance, arms crossed, surveying the boat as though it were some illegal contraption polluting her pristine world. She scribbled notes in a clipboard, snapping photos on her phone before retreating. It was the kind of intimidation the HOA relied on, silent surveillance, making residents feel as though they were constantly under watch. But to me, it only confirmed what I already knew. They were building a case. They believed they were preparing to corner me, not realizing that they were walking straight into their own trap. The third letter was the boldest yet. This one accused me not only of violating guidelines, but of endangering community resources. The HOA claimed my boat was an obstruction to shared enjoyment of the lake, citing complaints from unnamed residents. They warned that if I did not remove it within 7 days, they would take further action, which could include forcibly removing the boat at my expense. That was when I finally smiled. The HOA had crossed into dangerous territory without realizing it. To threaten removal of my property from my lake was not just arrogance, it was trespassing. They were no longer citing aesthetics or guidelines. They were attempting to exert control over something that was never theirs to begin with. And in doing so, they had given me the perfect opening to reveal the truth. But once again, I waited. I wanted them to commit fully, to put their threats in writing, to give me all the ammunition I needed. I knew the moment I revealed ownership, the entire foundation of their argument would collapse, but timing was everything. I needed the reveal to hit with maximum impact, not just to clear my name, but to make the HOA think twice before targeting me or anyone else again. The week that followed was a show of force from their side. They began sending emails to the Bonnet community, thinly veiled announcements about violations and non-compliant residents. While they didn't mention my name directly, everyone knew who they were talking about. Neighbors began to glance more frequently in my direction, some with curiosity, others with quiet concern. Then came the knock on my door. It was not the president herself, but 2 members of the HOA board, clipboard in hand, faces set in stern expressions. They informed me that the deadline was up, and unless the boat was removed immediately, the HOA would be forced to take matters into their own hands. They repeated the same language from the letter, warning of additional fines, legal action, and forced removal. Their voices carried the tone of authority, the same hollow confidence the HOA wielded over everyone else. I listened in silence, their words washing over me like a rehearsed performance. They expected fear. They expected resistance. What they didn't expect was calm patience. I gave them no reaction, only a steady gaze until they finished their speech and left, clearly unsettled by my lack of response. That night, I stood at the edge of the dock, the boat rocking gently beside me, the moonlight shimmering on the surface of the lake. I thought about the history of this water, how my grandparents had fished these same shores, how my father had taught me to row in the same boat the HOA now called a violation. This lake wasn't just property, it was legacy. And the HOA's arrogance had turned it into a battlefield. I knew the time for silence was nearly over. The HOA was convinced they had cornered me, their threats escalating with each step. But in reality, they had only cornered themselves. The moment they tried to lay claim to the lake, they walked into my territory. Literally. The next move would be mine, and it would not be subtle. Because the lake was not theirs. It never had been. And soon, everyone would know it. The morning it happened was bright and deceptively calm. A warm breeze rolled across the surface of the lake, carrying with it the sound of birds and the distant laughter of children already beginning their summer day. But in front of my home, a storm was brewing. I noticed the commotion before breakfast. A pickup truck rumbled down the narrow road, pulling behind it a flatbed trailer. 2 men in reflective vests hopped out, speaking casually as they sized up my dock. Behind them, the HOA president's car appeared, her polished sedan glinting in the sunlight. She stepped out in crisp attire, clipboard under her arm, her eyes locked firmly on my boat. So this was their next move, an attempt to remove it themselves. Men in vests began unspooling rope and moving toward the dock, their intentions obvious. The HOA president stood a few paces back, her arms crossed with the satisfaction of someone who believed victory was imminent. To her, this was just another display of power, another neighbor put back in their place. But what she didn't realize was that by sending her hired help onto my dock, she had crossed a line far greater than she imagined. I stepped outside and watched silently as the men prepared. They slowed when they saw me, their confidence faltering, as they realized the owner was present. Still, they gestured toward the boat, mumbling about needing to remove an unauthorized watercraft. It was clear they were contracted laborers, paid by the HOA, unaware that they were walking straight into a legal trap. The president approached, her voice sharp and self-assured as she explained that the HOA had authorized the removal. She spoke, as though her word was law, as though the lake behind me was hers to govern. I let her speak, her words piling up like kindling on a fire she didn't yet know was about to consume her. When she finally paused, waiting for compliance, I responded not with anger, but with paperwork. From under my arm, I unfolded the deed, my deed, the legal document clearly stating ownership of the lake and its shoreline, filed and recorded decades ago. I held it where she could see, the embossed seal gleaming in the morning light. Her expression shifted instantly. For the first time, cracks appeared in her composure. She stammered something about community rights and shared resources, but I shook my head slowly. The paper in my hand was not a suggestion, it was proof. The lake was mine, in full, without contest. The workers froze, unsure of what to do. They looked between me and the HOA president, realizing they had no authority here. To step foot on my dock now would not just be misguided, it would be trespassing. The president's confidence wavered, but her pride forced her to stand tall, insisting that the HOA guidelines superseded personal claims. That was the moment I finally let my voice carry the weight of truth. Calm but firm, I explained that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my boat, my dock, or the lake itself. Every kayak, every fishing trip, every so-called community event held on these waters, all of it existed only because my family had allowed it. I reminded her that without my ownership, their entire vision of lakeside living would crumble into dust. The men in vests exchanged looks, then slowly packed their ropes back into the truck. They had no interest in being pawns in the HOA's war. They left as quickly as they had arrived, their departure leaving only silence and a president whose face was flushed with a mix of embarrassment and fury. But it didn't end there. Later that week, I began receiving more letters, thicker envelopes stuffed with accusations and demands. The HOA tried to spin the situation, claiming I was withholding community access and endangering the neighborhood's harmony. They doubled the fines again, as if stacking imaginary numbers on paper could intimidate me. They even circulated emails suggesting I was misrepresenting ownership, warning residents not to be misled. It was a desperate attempt to save face, but it had the opposite effect. Word spread quickly among neighbors, and curiosity turned into quiet support. People began to ask questions they had never considered before. If the HOA didn't control the lake, then who did? And when they learned the answer, that it had always been privately owned, they began to look at the board with suspicion. I could feel the tide shifting. The president's once iron grip on the community was loosening, her authority eroded by the undeniable truth of my deed. Still, she refused to yield. At the next HOA meeting, which I attended for the first time in years, She attempted to rally the board against me. She spoke of rules, order, and the danger of letting one resident undermine the collective vision. But I came prepared. I presented the paperwork for all to see, laying it on the table where every member could examine it themselves. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument she could muster. One by one, the board members realized the truth. Their so-called guidelines had no power here. The lake was outside their reach. The president's voice faltered. She tried to pivot, suggesting partnership agreements or shared governance. But it was too late. The damage was done. The community now knew the truth, and no amount of spin could undo it. Still, I wasn't satisfied with simply clearing my name. The HOA had not just threatened me. They had tried to exert control over what was mine, dragging my family's legacy into their petty games. I wanted to make sure they could never try something like this again. Not with me, and not with any other neighbor. As I left the meeting, the plan was already forming. I had the legal advantage, the moral high ground, and the support of neighbors who were beginning to see the HOA for what it truly was, a self-serving machine built on fear. If the president wanted a war, I would give her one, but on my terms and on my lake, because the truth was no longer hidden. The HOA had stepped into waters they didn't own, and now they would learn what it meant to challenge the rightful owner. The boat rocked gently against my dock as I walked home, its presence no longer a symbol of violation, but of victory. And, in the rippling reflection of the lake, I saw not just calm water but the coming storm, the reckoning the HOA had brought upon themselves. The weeks that followed the meeting were tense, the air in the neighborhood charged with an unease everyone could feel. The revelation that the lake was mine had shaken the community, but instead of retreating gracefully, the HOA president grew more desperate. Her polished smile faded into something sharper, her actions more erratic. She had spent years building her authority on fear and intimidation, and now that it was slipping away, she was clinging to it with both hands. It started with whispers. Neighbors would approach me quietly, their voices low, telling me the HOA had begun spreading rumors. The president claimed I was hoarding the lake, that I was planning to restrict access entirely, cutting families off from the water they had come to rely on. She painted me as a tyrant, a selfish landowner who would rather see children locked out than share. The smear campaign spread quickly through emails and newsletters, every word dripping with carefully chosen venom. The president framed herself as the defender of the community, claiming she was fighting against my supposed greed. It was manipulative, a calculated attempt to twist the narrative, to make me the villain. But the truth has a way of piercing lies, and it wasn't long before cracks formed in her story. Many neighbors had known my family for years. They remembered my grandfather letting kids fish from the banks, my father clearing fallen trees so kayaks could pass, and me waving at boats as they drifted by my dock. None of us had ever restricted access. The lake had always been open, and everyone knew it. The idea that I would suddenly slam the door shut rang false, and people began to question why the HOA was pushing so hard to convince them otherwise. When rumors failed, the president escalated again. This time she turned to the language of lawyers. Another thick envelope arrived at my door, this one filled with official-looking documents. The HOA was threatening legal action, claiming implied community rights to the lake. They argued that years of shared use created precedent, giving them some measure of authority despite the deed in my hand. It was a bold move, but ultimately an empty one. I had already consulted with an attorney who assured me their claim held no weight. Property rights were not built on implication or wishful thinking. They were built on hard evidence, and the deed left no doubt. Still, I knew their attempt was not about winning in court. It was about dragging me into a battle, exhausting me with paperwork, hoping I would back down to avoid the headache. I refused. Instead, I doubled down. I began attending HOA meetings regularly, not as a participant, but as an observer. I watched. As the president struggled to maintain control, her voice growing sharper with each session. She tried to rally the board, but even her closest allies were beginning to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Every time the lake was mentioned, eyes turned toward me, the rightful owner sitting silently in the back row. My silence became my weapon. I didn't need to argue or shout. The deed spoke louder than any words, and the more the president raged, the more unhinged she appeared to those around her. Her insistence that she could overrule legal ownership made her look not powerful, but desperate. Still, she wasn't finished. One Saturday morning, I woke to find new signs posted at the community access points to the lake. Bold letters declared, "Community use temporarily restricted pending legal review." The president had ordered the gates locked, blocking families from launching kayaks or fishing from the shore. It was an audacious move, one that immediately sparked outrage. Parents stood at the gates with their children, confused and angry. Teenagers who had spent summers swimming in the shallows were left staring through the fence. The president had overplayed her hand. In her desperation to paint me as the villain, she had taken away the very resource she claimed to be protecting. For the first time, the community's frustration turned not toward me, but toward her. Whispers of discontent grew louder, frustration turning into open rebellion. I watched from my dock as families gathered across the lake, their voices echoing over the water. They didn't blame me for the locks. They knew where the order had come from. And as the president tried to justify her actions in hurried emails, her excuses fell flat. She claimed it was for legal protection and community safety, but no one was fooled. The truth was clear. The HOA was losing its grip, and she was lashing out blindly. That evening, I made my move. I drafted a letter, not to the HOA, but to every household in the neighborhood. In calm, measured words, I explained the reality. I shared the history of the lake, the deed proving ownership, and the decades of generosity my family had shown in allowing access. I assured them nothing had changed. They were still welcome to enjoy the lake as they always had. The only thing that threatened their access was the HOA itself and the president's attempt to twist the truth. I slipped copies of the letter into mailboxes, one by one, until every home had it. The next morning, the effect was immediate. Neighbors began arriving at my dock, some with words of thanks, others with quiet apologies for having believed the rumors. Children raced back into the water, laughter carrying across the lake once more. The locks at the access points suddenly seemed ridiculous, a futile barrier in the face of the truth. The president tried to fight back. She called an emergency meeting, raising her voice higher than ever, accusing me of manipulating the community. But the tide had turned. Board members avoided her gaze, residents questioned her authority, and the whispers of dissent had grown into open defiance. I sat silently, at the back, watching her unravel. The power she had once wielded so effortlessly was slipping through her fingers, undone not by confrontation, but by her own arrogance. And I knew the end was near, but I wasn't finished yet. Clearing my name was one thing. Protecting the lake and the community from future abuse was another. I had watched the HOA terrorize neighbors for years, using fear and intimidation as their tools. Now that I had exposed their weakness, I intended to do more than just win. I intended to dismantle their power once and for all. The president didn't know it yet, but the lake she had tried to control was about to become the very thing that destroyed her. By the time the 5th week arrived, the neighborhood had shifted. What once was quiet compliance to the HOA's every whim had transformed into open skepticism. The lake had always been the centerpiece of this community, and when the truth of its ownership spread from house to house, the foundation of the president's authority cracked beyond repair. Still, she refused to let go. The final act of her desperate reign came with a letter unlike any before. Heavy with legal jargon, stamped with the name of a law firm, it accused me of creating division in the community and threatened a lawsuit demanding shared governance rights over the lake. It was the boldest claim yet, built on a fantasy of entitlement. But what made it dangerous was not its validity, because it had none, but the spectacle it created. She wanted a stage, a final chance to rally the community against me, to claw back the control she had lost. She called for a special emergency meeting, open to every resident, to address the so-called lake crisis. Word spread quickly. Neighbors murmured about it at mailboxes and along sidewalks, their voices filled with both curiosity and frustration. When the day came, the community center overflowed with residents, the largest turnout in years. The president stood at the front, her posture rigid, her voice sharp as she launched into a tirade. She spoke of rights, fairness, and community values. She claimed I was hoarding a shared resource, that my ownership was a technicality, and that without the HOA's oversight, the lake would be ruined. Her words grew louder, her gestures sharper, each sentence designed to stoke fear, but the fear was gone. This time, the crowd didn't nod along. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanged skeptical looks, whispered to one another. The more she spoke, the more isolated she became. Her authority, once unchallenged, now sounded hollow. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I rose from my seat. The room quieted. I carried no anger in my voice, only calm resolve. I laid out the facts, the history of the lake, the deed, the decades of generosity my family had shown. I reminded everyone that their access had never been threatened by me, only by the locks she had ordered placed on the community gates. I explained how she had attempted to remove my boat, spread lies, and manipulated fears, not to protect the community but to preserve her own control. Then I handed copies of the deed to every board member and several residents in the front row. The embossed seal glimmered under the fluorescent lights. There was no arguing with it, no twisting it into something else. The truth was printed in black and white. Undeniable. Silence filled the room. Then came the murmurs, growing louder with each passing second. Questions flew at the board. Why hadn't they known this before? Why had the president lied? Why had she tried to strip away access to something that had always been freely given? The president's face flushed red. She tried to shout over the voices, tried to reassert control, but her words fell flat. The board members exchanged looks, and one by one they began to distance themselves. Some announced right then and there that they could no longer support her leadership. Others demanded a vote of confidence. The power she had clung to for so long was dissolving in real time, slipping through her fingers in front of the entire community. By the end of the night, it was over. The board moved to remove her as president, citing misconduct and abuse of authority. Though she protested furiously, her words had no weight. The same neighbors she had once intimidated with threats of fines and violations now sat with arms crossed, unimpressed by her theatrics. When she finally stormed out of the building, the echo of the closing door was the sound of an era ending. In the days that followed, the changes were swift. The locks on the community gates were removed, families once again launching their kayaks and fishing rods into the lake without fear. The board, stripped of its president's domineering influence, began softening its approach, focusing on actual maintenance and genuine concerns rather than petty control. Neighbors seemed lighter, freer, no longer glancing nervously at their mailboxes for the next violation notice. As for me, I returned to my dock, my boat rocking gently in the water. It was still there, the same vessel that had started the entire conflict. But now it was more than just a boat. It was a symbol of resistance, of standing firm against arrogance and entitlement. It was proof that sometimes the only way to deal with bullies is to show them that their power exists only where you allow it. The lake remained as it always had been, a place for peace, for fishing lines cast at dawn, for children laughing in the shallows, for neighbors waving as they paddled by. Nothing had changed, except the illusion that the HOA ever controlled it. I hadn't wanted a war, but the HOA had brought one to my doorstep. And when they did, they underestimated me. They thought I was just another homeowner who would bow under pressure. They forgot that the lake was mine, not just in paperwork, but in history, in legacy, in spirit. The president had claimed my boat violated guidelines. She had tried fines, threats, and smear campaigns. She had rallied meetings, hired contractors, even locked out her own community in her desperation. But in the end, all she had accomplished was her own downfall. And me? I remained exactly where I started, standing on the dock, the lake stretching endlessly before me, calm and unwavering. Because the truth had always been simple. The HOA could write as many letters as they wanted, but they didn't own the water beneath their words. I did.